Hey everybody. So today we're going to do an introduction of the second most famous Virginian in the colonial period, Thomas Jefferson. So who was Thomas Jefferson? Historians generally are mixed in terms of what to think about him, and here are a few facts. He was more folksy than the Federalists and a lot of members of his own party. He hated public pomp and ceremony. He hated powdered wigs. He wore plain clothes. He had red hair, and that doesn't signify anything, but historians always mention it. He had bounced back from both personal and political disasters. In 1782 he was in debt. His house burned. He lost his wife. Lots of personal disasters. His revolutionary term as Virginia governor was marred when he retreated from a possible capture rather than risk it. He was labeled a coward. He was a rationalist or a deist, we're not entirely sure which one, and at any rate he was neither a Christian nor a churchgoer. Jefferson was brought up in the informal and carelessly intellectual atmosphere of Virginia. As a young man, he was full of high spirits and high jinks, fond of riding, hunting, playing the violin, and reading. As he matured, he acquired an intellectual curiosity for practically every subject. He was an inventor. The dumbwaiters and the wheeled desk chair were invented by him. He was a naturalist, an architect, a natural mathematician, and a political philosopher. He designed both his own house, Monticello, which sits on the back of every nickel, and the entire campus of the University of Virginia, which he founded. He wrote books and pamphlets on everything, natural history, math, politics, and education especially. He was one of the greatest conversationalists of his time, and throughout his life he enjoyed freedom, leisure, and meeting new people. Politically, though, Jefferson was practically the opposite of Alexander Hamilton. Although he felt a strong national government would be an asset in international affairs, he worried at what such a government might do on the domestic scene. He was a strong advocate of the saying that a government that governs least governs best. I am not a friend, he said, to a very energetic government. He feared that a strong government would place limitations on the liberty of its people. He had fought for freedom against the British Crown and the control of an official church. He disliked cities with their manufacturing interests and large banking organizations. He felt that these institutions were dangerous in a republic because they eroded the population of free, independent, land-holding small farmers. He believed that America and Americans could remain free and happy if it remained a rural nation, what he called the yeoman farmers. Historians' assessments of Jefferson are mixed. If a historian likes Alexander Hamilton, then they dislike Jefferson, and vice versa. Some progressive historians like to make Thomas Jefferson a sort of premature New Deal Democrat. Some give him all the trappings of a late 20th century liberal. Some like to give him all the trappings of a Reagan Republican. A feature of Jefferson's life that helps make him fit so many molds is the fact that over a long and busy life, Jefferson wrote statements that range across a lot of different subjects and cover a wide range of ideas. His two most consistent and enduring themes, however, were agrarian republicanism and a distrust of a federal government that was too energetic, too powerful, too domineering toward the states. So, having staked out a couple of areas that help to define what Jefferson was, let's look at a few areas that Jefferson wasn't, but some historians like to think that he was. So how do we deal with the fact that the father of the Declaration of Independence was a slaveholder? Historians have squirmed around on that question for about 5 generations. There are a couple of ways to explain it. One, Thomas Jefferson never meant for the Declaration of Independence to apply to African Americans. The problem is that he specifically stated that natural rights applied as much to black Africans as to white Americans. If they applied to blacks in Africa and they were inalienable rights, then they must logically have applied to Africans in America. Jefferson also believed that Africans were biologically and intellectually inferior to Europeans. And this is an accurate statement of Jefferson's thought. But Jefferson argued that such inferiority in no way lessened one person's natural rights. Jefferson also believed that slavery was wrong, and this is true in terms of his thought certainly, but not his actions. Thomas Jefferson opposed slavery on paper. He asked, how could patriots inflict on others bondage worse than that inflicted upon patriots by Britain? But Jefferson was and remained a slaveholder all of his life. When Jefferson married in 1774, he acquired ownership of 1,800 acres and 300 slaves. He became one of the largest planters in Virginia. When a slave ran away, Jefferson went to the same lengths that any other planter would to get them back. He ran ads in the Virginia Gazette, and when the slaves were returned, he flogged them. Thomas Jefferson was reluctant to sell his slaves, but when he was in debt and confronted with the alternatives of selling land and selling slaves, he sold slaves. Slave breeding was a profitable business for Thomas Jefferson, as it was for many great planters. Historians use a statement from Jefferson to point to his essential humanity. Thomas Jefferson told his overseer to give his pregnant slave only light duties on the plantation. Historians often fail to quote the next sentence, where Jefferson says that he doesn't want to interrupt the reproductive pregnancy because a slave child brings more money than a pregnant woman could possibly produce with her labor. Thomas Jefferson's manumission record isn't very good. He only freed 2 slaves in his lifetime. 2 of his slaves bought their freedom, and on his death he freed 5 more. 5 to 7 of his slaves were related to him by blood. He deeded 200 slaves to his heirs. Not a very good record when compared to George Washington, for instance, who freed all of his slaves in his will and provided them with funds to settle in the Northwest. What we see in Thomas Jefferson's record on slavery is an early 19th century Southern planter aristocrat. Other planter aristocrats condemned slavery in their written works and kept slaves. His record on treatment of his slaves is not inhuman for his times, but neither was he a saint. Now, all that being said, years after his wife died, Thomas Jefferson took one of his slaves as a mistress, a woman by the name of Sally Hemings. Jefferson fathered at least 6 of Sally Hemings' children, and decades later freed all of them. She also accompanied Jefferson to Paris, where he served as ambassador to the United States. Since France had already abolished slavery, Sally was technically free in Paris. She agreed to return home to Virginia as an enslaved person on the condition where she would have quote-unquote extraordinary privileges for herself and freedom for her children. Just as the Declaration of Independence is a paradox, granting freedoms to a country that holds slaves, Jefferson's life itself was also a paradox. Another area to review his record on is Indian policy. The villain here is supposed to be Andrew Jackson, but Thomas Jefferson's record is very much like Jackson's. He wrote a letter while president that said we should be friendly with the Indians if they become farmers, spinners, weavers, and we could convert them from hunters to farmers by getting them into debt. Then they will either settle down and become like us, or will be forced to give up their ancestral lands and move across the Mississippi. If a tribe went to war to protect their land, then the military should defeat them, forcibly move them across the Mississippi, and then take their land. This is not quite a Jacksonian solution. After all, the Cherokees had become farmers, spinners, and weavers, and Jackson booted them anyway. But it is hardly much different. There is also a fairly typical white attitude toward Native Americans during the late 18th and 19th century. Native Americans should be respected, but only at a distance from whites, or, if they became, in effect, whites, by adopting white culture and lifestyles. A third area is education. In 1800, only the Northeast had public schools. Everywhere else, education was one of the things that separated the haves from the have-nots. In the South, the planters educated their children at home with tutors and then sent them to either William and Mary College or abroad to Britain or France for their more advanced education. Thomas Jefferson is often cited as a Virginian with an opposing view, a champion for public education in the South, a kind of 18th century John Dewey. This argument rests on his plan of education. He proposed 3 levels of schools: an elementary, where every white child would attend for 3 years. Then there would be a system of boarding schools financed at public expense or with tuition paid by wealthier parents, which was still cheaper than private tutors. And each year, 1 poor deserving student from each 10 grade schools would be sent to a boarding school. Over 3 years, all but 10 of these poor students would be dropped. The others would be educated at William and Mary at public expense. As Thomas Jefferson said, 10 talented students would be raked from the rubbish each year. Remember that education is not necessarily a democratic thing. It is just used frequently to indoctrinate the young into society, to promote conformity rather than democracy. Thomas Jefferson himself stated that his program was designed to fit the young into the social order, to teach children that happiness does not depend on the condition of life in which chance has placed them. The chief beneficiaries would be the planters who would pay less tuition for their children's education, and order in Virginia, in which the most intelligent poor youths would gain the opportunities that education provided the rich in Virginia, and thus be less likely to lead the poor against that society. Thomas Jefferson was, after all, a student of revolution. As an aristocrat, he feared them. He knew that rebellion and social change might be fomented by one gifted person who was frustrated by a society that held him down. His education plan was designed to place the 10 most potential troublemakers each year and incorporate them into Virginia aristocracy. This is hardly a democratic view of education. And next time, we'll see about Thomas Jefferson's rise to the top political office in the nation and take a look at his administration.